He looked the 7-foot-tall man up and down, smirked, and said, "You? In this restaurant? You can't even afford the napkins." The whole place went silent. What the waiter didn't know was that the man he just insulted wasn't just Big Shaq, the basketball legend. He was also the owner of the very restaurant they were standing in. And what happened next? Let's just say the waiter's entire life changed that night. "You? In this restaurant? Please, you can't even afford the napkins." The words didn't just sting. They sliced through the air like a razor, sharp enough to cut the tension in the room. A fork clattered onto a plate somewhere in the corner. The soft clinking of glasses stopped mid-motion. Even the mellow jazz music, drifting through the air a moment ago, now felt like it was playing from a mile away. Every eye in the restaurant turned toward the man who had just been insulted, a man who barely flinched at the attack. At first glance, you might not have recognized him. There was no camera crew following him, no roaring crowd chanting his name, no flashing lights capturing his every move. Just a tall figure in a dark hoodie and jeans, hands in his pockets, standing at the entrance like any other customer. But to millions around the world, this man wasn't just anybody. He was Big Shaq, the basketball legend, the unstoppable force on the court, the larger-than-life personality who could light up an arena with a single smile. Yet tonight, there was no smile, only a quiet, unreadable expression as his gaze locked on the waiter, who had just belittled him in front of the entire dining room. A few minutes earlier, everything had been normal. Rain pattered softly against the tall glass windows of the Oak Room, one of the city's most upscale restaurants. Inside, the glow of warm amber lights danced off polished wine glasses and silver cutlery. Couples leaned close over candlelit tables. Business partners exchanged firm handshakes, and waiters in crisp black uniforms floated smoothly between the tables, delivering dishes that looked more like works of art than meals. Shaq had slipped in quietly, pushing back his hood and scanning the room. It wasn't his first time here. In fact, he knew the place better than anyone. Months ago, he had bought a majority stake in this very restaurant. It was part of a business expansion few people knew about. He had purposely kept his ownership a secret from the staff, wanting them to treat him just like any other customer. If they were polite and professional, they'd never even know who had been tipping them generously from behind the scenes. But if they were rude or dismissive, well, let's just say tonight would prove why he kept that secret. Shaq picked a table in the corner near the window. The city lights glimmered on the wet streets outside, reflecting off puddles like tiny diamonds. He sat down and waited, watching the staff work. That's when he first noticed a waiter heading his way. Mark, mid-20s, sharp haircut, perfectly pressed uniform, walked with the kind of confidence that often teetered on arrogance. He scanned customers as he passed, his eyes subtly judging, assessing. Shaq recognized the look instantly. He'd seen it in people who thought they could size you up in a single glance. Mark didn't see a millionaire, a sports legend, or the man signing his paycheck. He just saw someone in casual clothes, maybe, in his mind, someone out of place in this high-end world. "Can I help you?" Mark asked, his tone not quite rude, but definitely not welcoming. "Yeah," Shaq replied, his voice calm. "Can I see a menu?" Mark raised an eyebrow. His lips curled in a faint smirk. And then came the sentence that would set the room on fire. "Menus are for customers who are actually going to order. You probably can't afford what we serve here." The remark hit the room like a thunderclap. A woman at the nearest table gasped so loudly it almost sounded rehearsed. A man halfway through sipping his wine froze mid-sip, eyes wide. Two waiters carrying plates slowed to a halt, caught between stepping forward and pretending they hadn't heard. Shaq didn't move. His massive frame stayed still, almost unnervingly calm. He looked at Mark for a long moment, his deep brown eyes studying him. Not with anger, but with something far more unsettling, patience. In that frozen second, 1,000 things could have happened. Shaq could have exploded, could have called the manager right there, could have walked out in disgust. But instead, he simply tilted his head slightly and asked, almost gently, "You think so?" Mark, misreading Shaq's calm for weakness, doubled down. "I know so," he said, leaning a little closer as if this was some sort of private joke between them. "Look, man, this is a fine dining place. You might be more comfortable at the burger joint down the street. Gasps rippled again through the room. Now, even the chef peeking from the kitchen door had stopped to watch. A busboy near the bar mouthed something under his breath that could only have been, "Is he crazy?" Shaq leaned back in his chair, a faint smile finally tugging at the corner of his mouth. It wasn't the smile of someone amused, more like the smile of someone who knew a secret no one else did. And in truth, he did know a secret. The man standing in front of him, the one speaking down to him as if he were nothing, had no idea that he was talking to the very person who could change his entire career in a single sentence. The man who could fire him on the spot. Or worse, teach him a lesson that would haunt him for the rest of his life. Shaq wasn't here just to eat dinner. He was here to see the truth, and the truth had just walked up to him wearing a smug grin and a black waiter's uniform. Outside, thunder rumbled faintly in the distance. Inside, the storm was already brewing. By the time Mark straightened his posture and prepared to walk away, the damage had been done. The entire dining room knew this wasn't just another customer interaction. This was the start of something big. Shaq placed his massive hands on the table, his eyes following Mark as he turned. He had a decision to make. Would he call the manager immediately and reveal who he was? Or would he play this game out, let it unfold slowly, and watch the young man dig himself deeper into a hole he couldn't climb out of? The corner of Shaq's mouth lifted again. Game on. The rain had stopped by the time Shaq walked out of the Oak Room, but inside, something far more important had happened. Mark stood at the doorway for a few seconds, watching the tall figure disappear down the street. He wasn't thinking about the embarrassment of that first night anymore. He wasn't thinking about the tip Shaq had just left. He was thinking about the journey in between. The hard conversations, the lessons from Carla, the humbling moments that had stripped away his pride and replaced it with purpose. A few customers lingered, sipping coffee, laughing with friends. Mark noticed how warm the room felt now, not because of the lights, but because of the atmosphere. And for the first time, he realized something that would stay with him forever. It's not the food, the decor, or even the celebrity owner that makes a place unforgettable. It's how you make people feel when they're there. Shaq had never given him a formal lecture. He hadn't punished him in some dramatic, movie-style way. Instead, he'd done something far more powerful. He'd given him the chance to change. And Mark had taken it. That's the thing about second chances. Not everyone gets one, and not everyone uses it. But when you do, it can change everything. So, the next time you meet someone, remember, you never know who they are, what they've been through, or the influence they hold. Treat everyone with the same respect you give the most important person in the room, because one day, they might just be. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share, because kindness, like stories, is meant to be passed on. 3 months later, the Oak Room was busier than ever. The soft golden lights glowed against the polished wood, and the low hum of conversation filled the space like a warm blanket. That evening, the front door swung open, and in walked a familiar figure, 7 feet tall, broad shoulders, and a presence that made heads turn without him saying a word. Shaq. But this time, he wasn't wearing a hoodie. He had on a sharp blazer over a black t-shirt, casual but still unmistakably confident. His eyes scanned the room, and then he spotted him. Mark. Mark was mid-conversation with a couple at table 7, smiling easily as he poured their wine. His posture was different now. No arrogance, no pretense, just genuine attentiveness. He noticed Shaq almost immediately, and for a brief second his smile froze. But then, to everyone's surprise, it grew wider. He excused himself from the couple politely and walked over. "Welcome back, Mr. O'Neill," Mark said, extending his hand. Shaq shook it, firm but warm. "Mark, heard you've been doing good work." "I've been trying, sir. Carla's been a great teacher. I owe her and you a lot." Shaq didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a seat at his old corner table. Mark didn't ask if he wanted the menu. He already knew what Shaq's favorite dish was from that first visit. Within minutes, Shaq's table was set with a preferred steak and a glass of the same wine he'd ordered months ago. Mark served it with the kind of care you'd expect at a 5-star resort. No shortcuts. No rush gestures. As the night went on, Shaq noticed something else. Mark wasn't just treating him this way. Every customer got the same smile, the same patience, The same feeling of being important. When Mark returned to check on him, Shaq said, "You've come a long way." Mark nodded. "I realize this job isn't just about food or service. It's about respect. I used to think it mattered who someone was. Now I know it only matters how I treat them." Shaq grinned. "Sounds like you learned the most important thing about running a restaurant, or anything, really." Mark smiled. "And what's that?" "People always remember how you made them feel." Shaq finished his meal, left a generous tip, and as he stood to leave, he placed a hand on Mark's shoulder. "Keep it up, kid. You're making me proud to have you here." And just like before, he slipped out into the night. But this time, Mark didn't feel a sinking pit of dread in his stomach. Instead, he felt something entirely new: pride. The rest of the night at the Oak Room felt different. The tension that filled the air just minutes ago began to fade, replaced by a quieter, almost reflective mood. Mark returned to the floor, but the change in him was immediate. He approached each table with a genuine good evening instead of the clipped, perfunctory greetings he'd given before. His voice softened, his posture relaxed, and when a man in a worn jacket asked for water, Mark poured it with the same care he'd use for a VIP ordering the finest wine. It wasn't perfect. You can't undo years of bad habits in an hour, but it was a start. Shaq stayed for a little while longer, sipping the last of his wine, speaking quietly with Charles, the manager. He didn't ask for special treatment. He didn't even mention the incident again. But the staff noticed that he kept an eye on Mark from across the room, not in a menacing way, but like a coach watching a rookie in his first game after a big talk. When Shaq finally stood to leave, the room subtly shifted again. Conversations dipped. A couple of customers clapped lightly, not loud enough to make a spectacle, but enough to acknowledge what they'd just witnessed. Shaq gave them a small wave and walked out into the rainy night, hoodie up, blending once again into the crowd outside. Over the next few weeks, something unexpected happened. Mark didn't just follow orders, he embraced them. He shadowed Carla, the restaurant's best waiter, a woman with a warm smile and a memory so sharp she could remember a customer's favorite wine after a single visit. She taught him how to anticipate needs, how to listen instead of rush, and how the smallest gesture, like remembering a customer's name, could turn a one-time diner into a lifelong guest. At first, Mark was awkward. It felt unnatural to him to greet everyone with the same enthusiasm. But slowly, something changed. The work started to feel less like a game of sizing people up and more like a chance to connect. By the third week, customers began mentioning him by name in their reviews. "Mark was wonderful," one wrote. "He made us feel welcome from the moment we walked in," said another. Charles, the manager, passed the feedback along to Shaq, who simply nodded and said, "Good. Keep watching him." The ripple effect spread through the whole restaurant. Other staff members noticed a shift and followed suit, making the Oak Room feel warmer and more welcoming than ever. And though no one announced it publicly, everyone knew the turning point. The rainy Tuesday night, when the tallest man in the room taught the smallest lesson with the biggest impact. Mark's face was pale now, his earlier swagger replaced by the unmistakable look of a man who had just realized he'd made the biggest mistake of his career. Shaq didn't move closer. He didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to make the moment feel 10 times heavier. "I could fire you right here, right now," Shaq said, his voice even but edged with finality. "One call, and you be gone before the kitchen sends out the next appetizer." Mark's throat bobbed as he swallowed hard. "Please don't. I wasn't thinking." Shaq tilted his head. "You were thinking. You just weren't thinking the right way. You saw a man in a hoodie and sneakers and decided he wasn't worth your time. And I guarantee you've done that before." Mark didn't argue. He couldn't. The truth was too obvious. The dining room was still silent, but now it wasn't just curiosity in the air. It was anticipation. What would Shaq do? Would this be the dramatic firing everyone was expecting? Or something else entirely? Shaq let the pause stretch, making sure Mark felt the weight of the moment. Then he said something no one in the room expected. "You're not fired." Mark blinked. "I'm not." "No," Shaq continued. "But you're going to spend the next month shadowing our best waiter. You'll watch how they treat people. You'll learn that every customer is a VIP, whether they're wearing a tuxedo or a t-shirt. And if I hear one more story like tonight, You're done. No warnings. No second chances. Mark's shoulders sagged in relief, but his embarrassment didn't fade. I understand, sir, he said quietly. Shaq gave a short nod. Good. Now, go help the table in the back. They've been waiting too long. Mark turned and walked away quickly, his posture different now. Less swagger, more humility. Around the room, customers exchanged glances. A few even smiled. They just witnessed something rare, a man with power choosing to teach instead of destroy. Shaq sat back down, his expression calm again. He didn't need to make a big scene or gloat. The lesson had been delivered, and he knew it would stick. The chocolate souffle was gone, the last sip of the $800 wine swirled in Shaq's glass, and the dining room felt like it was holding its breath. People weren't just eating anymore, they were watching. Mark strutted toward the table with the final bill tucked neatly inside a black leather folder. His smirk had grown wider with each step. Like a man walking toward victory, he thought was guaranteed. He placed the bill in front of Shaq with deliberate precision. That'll be $1,472. I'll need payment up front, he said, just loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear. A ripple of whispers spread across the room. Shaq didn't even glance at the bill. Instead, he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. Mark's smirk twitched. Here it comes, he thought. The excuses. The embarrassment. But Shaq didn't open a banking app. Instead, he tapped a contact and said into the phone, Yeah. Can you come over to table 7? Thanks. Seconds later, the restaurant manager, a well-dressed man named Charles, hurried over. His eyes landed on Shaq and instantly widened. Mr. O'Neill, I didn't know you were coming tonight. Gasps erupted from nearby tables. One woman whispered, I told you it was him. Mark froze, his smirk collapsing into confusion. O'Neill? Wait, Big Shaq? Like the owner? Shaq stood up slowly, towering over Mark. Even in the soft restaurant lighting, the shift in the room's energy was undeniable. That's right, Shaq said calmly. I own this place, and I've been watching how you treat my customers. Mark swallowed hard, his voice suddenly small. I didn't know. Exactly, Shaq interrupted. You didn't know. And you shouldn't have to know who someone is to treat them with respect. The room was silent except for the faint hum of the jazz band in the corner. Shaq's voice carried through the still air, firm but not shouting. It doesn't matter if someone walks in here wearing a $10 suit or a $10,000 suit. You treat them the same. Every person who walks through that door is the reason you have a job. Mark's eyes darted toward the floor. His earlier arrogance had vanished, replaced by a flush of embarrassment that crept up his neck. I'm sorry, he muttered. Shaq shook his head. Don't apologize to me. Apologize to every person you've ever looked down on, because I guarantee I'm not the first. The customer sat frozen, hanging on every word. What had started as an ordinary night of fine dining had turned into a live lesson in humility. And for Mark, the night was far from over. Mark disappeared toward the kitchen, the order slip in hand, shaking his head with a smug little grin. In his mind, this was going to be the easiest, I told you so of his life. He pictured the moment later in the night, when the bill would land on the table and the mystery man in the hoodie would fumble for excuses. Shaq, on the other hand, leaned back in his chair, unfazed. He had been in tighter spots, championship games with seconds on the clock, high-pressure business deals worth millions. Compared to those, this was nothing. Still, he wasn't here just to eat. He was here to observe. The waiter service from the rest of the staff was a sharp contrast to Mark's behavior. Another server quietly refilled Shaq's water glass, even though it wasn't her table. A busboy swept up crumbs from a nearby table. Sneaking glances at Shaq were a mix of excitement and concern. The room had a strange energy now. Conversations had dipped into hushed whispers. A couple at the next table whispered, That's Shaq, right? The basketball guy. Yeah, and I think that waiter's about to lose his job. Shaq's first course arrived, lobster bisque served in fine china, steam curling upward like a signal. The head chef himself, a tall man in a spotless white jacket, delivered it. He recognized Shaq immediately, his eyes widening for just a split second before he masked it with a polite smile. "I hope you enjoy this, sir," the chef said quietly. Shaq gave him a nod. "I'm sure I will." Mark returned a few minutes later with the wine, a vintage bottle that cost more than some people's rent. He opened it with exaggerated care, as if trying to make the moment even more dramatic. "This one's $800 a bottle," he said, just loud enough for the nearby tables to hear. Shaq simply smiled. "Pour it." Mark raised an eyebrow but obeyed, filling the glass. Shaq swirled it gently, took a sip, and nodded with quiet approval. Course after course arrived. Wagyu steak glistening under the lights, truffle risotto, oysters on ice. Shaq tasted each one slowly, never rushing, savoring every bite. To the untrained eye, it looked like he was just enjoying dinner. But in reality, Shaq was letting the clock run down, the way he used to in the final seconds of a game. He was giving Mark just enough rope to hang himself with. At one point, Mark stopped by the table. "So," he said with a smirk, "you enjoying your investment?" Shaq glanced up. "Every bite." "Good," Mark replied. "I'll make sure you get the check soon. Don't want to keep you here too long." Shaq didn't respond. He just smiled that same quiet smile he'd been wearing since the moment they met. The kind of smile that made you wonder if you just missed something important. And in Mark's case, he definitely had. By the time dessert arrived, a towering chocolate souffle, the whispers in the dining room had reached their peak. Some customers were openly watching now, waiting for the bill to arrive. The tension was thick enough to taste. Mark believed he was minutes away from his big gotcha moment. Shaq knew he was minutes away from turning the entire night upside down. Shaq flipped through the menu slowly, his huge hands almost making the elegant leather cover look like a children's book. The dishes were high-end, Wagyu beef, truffle-infused risotto, lobster tail flown in from Maine that morning. Prices weren't printed next to every item, but anyone familiar with fine dining knew this was the kind of place where dinner could cost more than a week's rent. Mark stood there, shifting his weight impatiently. He glanced toward a group of executives at the other end of the room, clearly wishing he could be serving them instead. Shaq looked up from the menu. "You got any recommendations?" he asked casually. Mark's smirk returned instantly. "Honestly, none of this is really in your price range. We have a burger place down the street. Might be more your style." The words hung in the air like a slap. At the next table over, a woman nearly dropped her fork. A man at the bar leaned over to his friend, whispering, "Did he just say that to Shaq?" Some customers clearly recognized a man sitting there. But to Mark, he was just a tall stranger who didn't fit his definition of fine dining clientele. Shaq kept his composure. Years in the public, I had taught him how to stay calm under pressure, whether it was a championship game with millions watching, or a smug waiter trying to embarrass him in a crowded room. "You think I can't afford it?" Shaq asked, his voice so steady it almost sounded like a challenge. Mark shrugged, as if the answer was obvious. "I know you can't." It wasn't just what he said, it was the way he said it. The casual dismissal, the smug certainty, the complete lack of awareness that he was speaking to a man whose monthly shoe budget was probably bigger than the restaurant's annual profit. A ripple of tension spread through the room. The soft jazz music felt distant now, like background noise to a movie scene that was building toward a pivotal moment. A busboy froze mid-step, holding a tray in the air. Even the chef in the open kitchen peeked up from behind the counter. Shaq slowly set the menu down on the table. His eyes didn't leave Mark's face. "All right then," he said calmly. "Let's do this. Bring me the most expensive items on this menu." "All of them." Mark blinked. "Excuse me." "You heard me," Shaq replied. "And don't forget the wine list. I want your best bottle." Mark hesitated for a moment, trying to decide whether Shaq was serious. Then, with a half smile that suggested he thought he was about to watch someone embarrass themselves, he jotted down an order and walked away. As he did, Shaq leaned back in his chair, his massive frame relaxed. He wasn't angry. He wasn't even annoyed. He was patient. Because what Mark didn't know was that by the end of the night, the bill wouldn't be the only thing served. There'd also be a lesson, and it would be one he'd never forget. Mark Whitman wasn't new to the Oak Room. In fact, he'd been working there for almost 2 years, long enough to know every table number by heart, every regular customer by name, and exactly which wine to recommend to which kind of diner. On paper, he was the kind of employee most restaurants would want. He never missed a shift. He knew the menu like the back of his hand. He could balance 3 plates on one arm without spilling a drop. But beneath that professional surface, there was a problem. Mark had a habit, a dangerous one in the service industry. He judged people. If a man walked in wearing a tailored suit and an expensive watch, Mark's smile could light up the whole room. His voice would get warmer, his service more attentive. He'd address them as sir or ma'am, make small talk, and check on them constantly. But if someone came in wearing jeans and a hoodie, the smile would vanish. His tone would turn flat. And if the place was busy, those customers might wait twice as long for their food. It wasn't just arrogance, it was insecurity. Mark had grown up in a rough part of town. His family didn't have much money, and he had always felt like an outsider in wealthy spaces. Now that he worked in one of the fanciest restaurants in the city, he saw it as his chance to finally be on the other side. But instead of showing compassion to people who reminded him of where he came from, he distanced himself from them. It was as if every casually dressed diner was a mirror of his own past, a past he was desperate to erase. And so, when Big Shaq walked in that rainy night, wearing a plain hoodie and sneakers, Mark didn't see a customer. He saw someone who, in his mind, didn't belong. Shaq noticed it immediately. Years in the public, I had made him an expert in reading people. You could tell a lot from the way someone looked at you, whether it was admiration, intimidation, or, in Mark's case, quiet disdain. Shaq didn't take it personally. In fact, he almost felt sorry for Mark. Almost. But there was a principle at stake here. When you worked in a place like the Oak Room, you didn't just represent yourself. You represented the entire brand. Every person who walked through the door was there for an experience, and that experience started with how you treated them. Mark was about to learn that lesson the hard way. Even as other waiters moved smoothly from table to table, Mark lingered at Shaq's, standing with the casual arrogance of someone who thought he had the upper hand. His arms rested on the table's edge, his body language practically saying, "I'm in control here." What Mark didn't realize was that Shaq wasn't just some random customer who'd shrug and walk away. He was a man who had built his life on discipline, strategy, and timing, and right now, he was playing the long game. Shaq wasn't angry. Not yet. He was curious. How far would Mark take this? Would he continue treating him like an inconvenience? Would he double down on his smugness? Or would he catch himself and change his tune? Shaq decided to find out. And so, instead of leaving or confronting him outright, Shaq leaned back, glanced at the menu Mark was still holding, and said casually, "All right, let's see what you've got here. I'm hungry." Mark hesitated, then finally placed the menu on the table. But the way he did it, a little too fast, almost like he was tossing it, didn't go unnoticed. Shaq smiled faintly to himself. The trap was set. Shaq didn't come to the Oak Room that night by accident. For weeks, he had been thinking about dropping by unannounced. The restaurant was one of his newest investments, a quiet side project compared to the sports franchises, real estate, and businesses he'd poured his money into over the years. But unlike most of his ventures, this one had a personal touch. He loved food, not just eating it, but the art, the presentation, the way a single dish could bring strangers together at the same table. Owning a fine dining spot wasn't just about profit. It was about creating an experience. That's why he'd been so careful about the staff he hired. The head chef, one of the best in the country. The menu, a blend of modern cuisine and old-world recipes. The location, prime real estate, right in the heart of the city. The only piece of the puzzle he hadn't tested yet was service. When Shaq bought the place, he deliberately stayed in the shadows. The staff were told the owner was a private investor who preferred to remain anonymous. That meant no special treatment if he came in as a regular customer. No cameras, no fanfare, just him and the food. Tonight, he decided to see firsthand how his customers were treated when no one thought they were being watched. He had driven himself, no security detail, no assistant, just a big guy in a hoodie, jeans, and sneakers, blending into the rainy streets. By the time he stepped to the glass doors, the warmth of the restaurant wrapped around him, carrying the aroma of fresh rosemary, garlic, and seared steak. He was looking forward to a quiet night. Instead, he was met by Mark, the one waiter who could turn that peaceful evening into a storm. From the moment their eyes met, Shaq noticed it. The quick scan up and down, the barely noticeable tightening of the lips, the unspoken "you don't belong here." Shaq had seen it before, back in his early basketball days, when he was a young, unknown player walking into luxury spaces for the first time. People judge you in seconds. The wrong clothes, the wrong look, the wrong assumptions, and suddenly you were invisible, or worse, a target for humiliation. But tonight wasn't like those days. Tonight, Shaq was the one with the power, and Mark had no idea. The restaurant's other customers, meanwhile, were oblivious to the brewing tension. A couple in the corner laughed over champagne. A group of business executives clinked glasses at the bar. The soft jazz music floated through the air, a false sense of calm before the drama to come. Shaq was seated near the window, the rain streaking down the glass beside him. The city's lights shimmered in the puddles outside, almost in rhythm with the sound of silverware tapping plates. Mark stood there with a menu tucked under his arm, leaning slightly as if this interaction was already a waste of his time. And then he made his fatal mistake. Menus are for customers who are actually going to order. You probably can't afford what we serve here. The air thickened instantly. Conversations faltered. Even the bartender paused mid-pour. Shaq's head turned slightly, eyes narrowing, not with rage, but with curiosity. He had come here to test the staff. And in one short sentence, Mark had failed the test in spectacular fashion. Still, Shaq didn't call the manager. He didn't reveal who he was. Not yet. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, calm as ever. "You think so?" he asked quietly. "I know so," Mark replied, the smirk never leaving his face. Shaq gave a slow, deliberate nod, as if accepting the challenge. The game had officially begun.